Another one.
This one says, what is the difference between contract and acceptance test? They seem to be the same concept in sending real requests to the server and ensuring the response looks right. Does anyone know what the difference actually is? All right, so let's start off our timer. So, funny enough, just last week, I was in a training for contract testing. Yes, I was. And we were doing the contract. So it was based on the library or package, depending on what tool that you use, called Pact, right? And so that was my first time using Pact. This is my first time like really hearing about contract testing. So there's the difference. Like I think there's a pretty big difference between contract testing and acceptance testing. I th- I would personally put contract testing on a closer realm of like unit testing. But really, what contract testing is doing is it's so I'm going to break it down to how the trainer broke it down to us, right? In APIs, there is a provider and there's a consumer, right? What contract testing is doing is it's testing the API contract, right, between the consumer and the provider, right? So, and then based on that, there can be like there's consumer driven contracts and then there's provider driven contracts, right? And you can do the testings in on both sides, right? So you can say, okay, this is a provider driven contract, and we're going to do the testing that way. And then you can do that. There's a consumer driven contract, and you're going to do the contract testing that way. There's also something called bidirectional testing, which is all that I learned. I learned all of this. That's not all that I learned, but I learned all of this last week in the training. So now that since you asked that question, I'm going to share it with you, right? So with that being said, with the contract testing, so the consumer defines how their contract is like how they want the contract to be, right? And then and now the provider, they would take that and say, okay, does the consumer's contract match the contract that we're putting out, right? And the thing is with the consumer driven contract, you can have different consumers having a version of the contract that the provider has to adhere to, right? So that is the general gist of contract testing. And with the tools like Pact and stuff like that, who facilitate this type of contract testing. So you'd have like a contract repository, right? Saying, okay, the and that's why I have a hard time understanding like the question about the relationship to acceptance testing because from what I saw when you're doing the contract testing, it is so integrated with the code base, right? So let's say you're coding in C sharp, then you're going to have your contract test in C sharp, right? So you're saying, okay, you are like the same way you do unit tests, the same way you do unit tests, where you would say, okay, I am going to call this class and then extend and then like use this method in this class to perform this action. And then these, like when I'm passing these parameters into my unit test, this is what I should get. And this is what I should, and so this is my expected results. That's pretty much the way that the contract test goes, right? So you say, okay, this, I'm calling in this class that's doing these API calls, API requests, right? And the API, so this controller is saying that and that's the thing. The contract testing is happening at the controller level, right? So you're saying that this controller does a post to this endpoint, right? So now you're calling that controller and you're saying that you're calling that controller. You're saying that when I do this post, this is the expected. This is how we expect the provider to return this type of this request to us, right? So that is like that's the part of the contract. It's so integrated into the code base, right? That for me at least, it's more of a unit test level, but it's it's not a unit test because that's not what unit tests do, right? So now they go into the contract repository. So the consumer sends it to the provider as well as to the contract repository, and the provider also goes to, like, so they meet in the middle and they say, okay, here is like everything matches, you're good to deploy, or we have a conflict, something doesn't match, and then now you have the conversation between teams. And here's the difference between unit tests and definitely, like, so I don't like, to me acceptance test is not in the picture, right? But this is the difference between the unit test and the contract test, right? The unit test, you are testing out your code paths in your code base, right? But with the contract test, whether it is an external API provider or it is a, like, let's say your team works on two different microservices, right? And they're communicating with each other. You can have contract tests between those microservices where that and those are like testing two different applications, right? Two different APIs, so that you're saying, okay, do these APIs work well and communicate well together, or are there some conflicts that we need to resolve, right? A quick example that we got this one in the course, in the training, right? If the date format is supposed to be in one way, like let's say it's supposed to be year dash month dash day, right? But the other microservice is, like, the provider is returning it in, like, writing out the month, like, so writing out February 4th, 2024, then like, although they're both returning a date, but the format is incorrect and the contract test would fail because of the incorrect format, right? But that's not a unit test, because in the unit test, it is testing that code path. So the code path would say, okay, yeah, it creates a date, great. But with the contract testing, it's comparing it's seeing if the two services, the two APIs are in sync or if they're in harmony. So it's saying if one says this date format is being sent, is expected this way, but we're actually sending the date format that way. Now we have Houston, we have a problem, and then we need to work that out. All right. So hopefully that gave a good understanding and explanation of what contract testing is and difference between total difference between acceptance testing, but hopefully it does give a difference between that and unit testing. All right. Hopefully that helps.
If you enjoyed the fascinating information shared in this video and you want more, be sure to hit the subscribe button to Tech Coach Ralph to be notified for new videos.